They had built a life together that felt safe and predictable. Every morning, the alarm would ring at the same time, and the same small rituals would follow. She would make coffee while he showered. He would check the news on his phone while she read her favorite book. They would sit at the small kitchen table, not speaking much, but feeling the comfort of shared silence. The routine was simple, yet it carried a kind of unspoken love that had developed over years. It was easy, it was quiet, and it was familiar. On weekends, they would go for walks in the nearby park. Sometimes they would talk, but often they would walk side by side, lost in their own thoughts. There was no arguing, no shouting, no drama. Just two people moving together through life day by day. Friends often commented on how well they fit together, how lucky they were to have found such a steady, calm love. And in many ways, they were lucky. But that kind of calm had begun to feel more like a habit than a heartbeat. She noticed it first. The way he laughed less, how his eyes sometimes seemed distant. He would nod when she spoke, but she felt his mind wandering somewhere else. She wondered if she was imagining it, but the small things added up. A missed dinner? A forgotten plan? A sigh when she tried to bring up feelings. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe he was tired. Maybe she was overthinking. But inside, a quiet worry began to grow. He, on the other hand, felt the same unease, but didn't know how to name it. The love he had for her was still there, strong and steady, but it had become comfortable. Comfortable enough that he took it for granted. Comfortable enough that he sometimes forgot the little things that once mattered so much. He noticed her quiet glances, the subtle distance creeping in, but he chalked it up to moodiness or stress. Life had its pressures and love was supposed to survive them, wasn't it? Their home was cozy, filled with reminders of the years they had spent together. Photos lined the walls, showing trips they had taken, parties with friends, quiet mornings with coffee in hand. Each picture told a story, a moment captured in time, but the presence of these memories made the silence heavier. They were proof of joy, but also a reminder that joy required attention, effort, and sometimes risk. And lately, attention and effort felt like things that belonged to the past. One evening, she cooked a meal she knew he loved. She set the table carefully, lighting a candle even though it was just the two of them. When he came home, he smiled, kissed her cheek, and sat down. She watched him, expecting some warmth, some acknowledgement of her thoughtfulness. But he barely noticed. He complimented the food, yes, but there was a distance in his eyes, a focus elsewhere. It stung, even if she tried not to show it. She wondered silently if he felt the same emptiness she felt. They had not fought in months. That should have been a good thing, but instead, it felt like they were avoiding something. Talking had become about logistics and routine, never about feelings or dreams. She missed the late-night conversations where they would talk about life, hopes, and fears. He missed the way she used to make him feel seen, like he was more than just a role in a routine. Both were trapped in a pattern that kept them together physically but let their hearts drift slowly apart. Friends still invited them out, but they often declined, claiming tiredness or obligations. When they did go, they were polite, cordial, even happy, but the spark that once drew them together was now muted. They smiled at each other across the table, laughed at shared jokes, but inside, both wondered how long it could last if this continued. There was love, yes, but it was quiet, almost hidden, and both feared that without care, it might fade completely. She started to notice the small habits that had changed over the years. The way he no longer reached for her hand when they walked, how he sometimes left her words hanging without response, or how he seemed content to sit in silence rather than reach out. She tried to bring it up gently, but conversations quickly returned to surface-level topics. She felt a growing loneliness, one that came not from being alone, but from feeling unseen. He noticed the change in her, too, the way she would look at him with a questioning expression. The moments when she seemed almost on the verge of tears but held back. He wanted to reach out, to say something meaningful, but he wasn't sure what to say. The words that once came easily now felt heavy, clumsy, insufficient. And so he said nothing, hoping that her attention would return naturally. not realizing that silence could be more damaging than confrontation in the quiet moments. Both reflected on the years they had shared. Memories of laughter, travel, first dates, and small acts of kindness filled their minds. They remembered the intensity of early love, the nights spent talking until dawn, the promises made under starlit skies. And they realized that all those things, once effortless, now required awareness, effort, and attention. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Despite the growing distance, there were still moments of connection. A shared joke, a touch on the shoulder, a look that carried unspoken meaning. These moments reminded them both of what was at stake, of the depth of their bond and the potential loss if they continued to drift. It was enough to keep them together, but it was not enough to restore what had been slowly fading. As days passed, the protagonist started to feel a quiet determination. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. She realized that love, even when strong, could become dormant, if not nurtured. She decided to pay attention, to try to rekindle the closeness that had once defined them. Small acts, heartfelt words, and intentional presence became her focus. She wanted to remind both herself and him of the love they had, before it was too late. He, too, began to notice the changes. He saw her efforts, subtle but sincere, and they stirred something deep inside him. A realization that love was not just a feeling but a choice, an active decision to care, connect, and protect what they had built together. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark, a reminder that the heart required attention as much as the routine of life required habit. Evening after evening, small gestures started to fill their home. Shared meals, meaningful conversations, and quiet moments of togetherness began to break the monotony. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle, persistent return to connection. They laughed more freely, held each other longer, and listened more carefully. The awareness of what could be lost gave their love a new clarity, a sharper focus, and a renewed sense of purpose. And yet beneath the surface, both understood that this was only the beginning. Awareness and effort could not erase years of quiet neglect. The story of their love was far from complete, and the challenges ahead would test their willingness to truly see each other, to value each other, and to fight for what they almost let slip away. But for now, the first cracks of renewal were forming, and the faint warmth of hope began to spread through their quiet, comfortable life. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was alive. That alone was a start. Life had begun to feel different, though neither of them could put it into words. The routines continued, but something subtle had shifted. Conversations that once flowed naturally now sometimes stumbled, and silences grew longer. She noticed it when he came home one evening, distracted, scrolling on his phone as if the world outside was more interesting than what was in their own living room. She tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his day, but his responses were short, almost automatic. The warmth that once accompanied his smile seemed distant, a reminder that something was slipping away. She started paying closer attention to the signs that she had ignored before. The way he sometimes left the kitchen without saying a word after dinner, or how he seemed lost in thought during moments they used to share. She caught herself wondering if he had stopped caring or if life had simply made him forget the small things that mattered. At first, she told herself it was nothing, that people changed, that relationships had natural ebbs and flows. But a quiet unease had begun to grow, something she could not shake. He, too, had started noticing subtle shifts in her behavior. The quiet sighs, the occasional tense posture, the way her eyes sometimes betrayed a worry she would not speak aloud. He knew he was responsible in part, that the comfort he felt had led him to be careless in the little ways that mattered. And yet, when he tried to address it, the words seemed heavy, awkward, insufficient. Instead, he hoped she would move past it, not realizing that hope without action was fragile. One weekend, they had an argument, small but significant. She mentioned a friend's observation about relationships needing attention, and he responded defensively, saying they were fine as they were. The conversation escalated into a quiet tension rather than an explosive fight, a tension that lingered long after words had stopped. Neither wanted to be wrong, yet both felt the sting of unspoken truths. It was a turning point. subtle warning that the love they relied upon for comfort was now under threat. In the following days, she reflected on the situation. She remembered the early days of their relationship, when every small act carried meaning and excitement. How he would surprise her with little gestures. How she would wait for his texts with anticipation. How love had been present in every glance, every touch, every shared secret. And now, those gestures were gone, replaced by routine and complacency. The thought of losing the depth of connection they once had filled her with unease. He, meanwhile, tried to process his own feelings. He knew she had noticed the changes, and part of him felt guilty, but another part felt lost. He missed the closeness they once had, yet he didn't know how to recreate it. He had been coasting on the stability of their relationship, thinking that love was a constant that required no maintenance. Now he understood that love, like anything valuable, needed attention, or it would quietly wither. She started trying small things to bring back connection. She cooked his favorite meals, left notes for him to find, and attempted to initiate conversations that went deeper than schedules and chores. Some days he responded warmly, smiling at her efforts, remembering old jokes, sharing a story about his day. Other days, he remained distant, caught in thought, unaware of the cracks forming in their connection. The inconsistency frustrated her, yet she kept trying. Believing that love deserved the effort, he began to notice her persistence. The way she continued to engage, even when he seemed unreachable, stirred something within him. He realized that he had taken her for granted, assuming that love required no effort once it existed. Slowly, he began to respond, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes warmly, rediscovering the small joys of being seen and appreciated. But the fear of loss had begun to creep in. He could sense that if he didn't pay attention soon, they might drift further apart. One afternoon, she invited him to a quiet place in the park, the one where they had spent hours talking in the past. She wanted to talk about their relationship, not to accuse, but to understand and reconnect. As they walked side by side, the conversation started gently. She spoke about her feelings, her fears, and the moments when she felt distant from him. He listened, not interrupting, realizing that she was opening herself in a way that required trust and courage. He felt a mix of relief and guilt, understanding that he had allowed routine to cloud their love. The discussion was not easy. They stumbled over words, paused in awkward silences, and sometimes felt frustrated at their inability to fully express what they meant. Yet in those moments, there was a raw honesty that had been missing for years. She realized that love could not be taken for granted, and he understood that the heart required conscious effort. They both acknowledged the subtle distance that had grown, agreeing silently that it needed attention before it became unbridgeable. After that conversation, small changes began to appear in their daily lives. He started noticing her more, thanking her for the little things, asking about her day, and listening with intent. She, in turn, felt encouraged, realizing that he was capable of recognition and care, even after years of complacency. Their home began to feel warmer, conversations longer, and laughter more natural. They were slowly reconnecting, rediscovering the bond that had always been there, but had been hidden beneath the weight of routine. Despite these improvements, there was still tension. Both were aware that the cracks had existed for a long time, and healing would require patience and persistence. They experienced moments of doubt, wondering if the love that had once been effortless could truly be restored. Yet each time they shared a meaningful conversation, a genuine laugh, or a thoughtful gesture, they were reminded that love, though threatened, was not lost. Family and friends began to notice subtle changes too. Friends who had previously commented on their quiet routines now noticed the renewed spark, the way they seemed more engaged with each other. Family members remarked on the warmth returning to their home, and both felt a quiet reassurance that their efforts were not going unnoticed. This external acknowledgement encouraged them to keep trying, understanding that love required more than comfort. It required active attention, understanding, and care. She reflected on the lessons learned so far. That love is not a constant that survives without effort. that moments of distance or neglect are not signs of failure, but warnings to be present and attentive. That communication, honesty, and small gestures of care are essential to sustain connection. And most importantly, that love often becomes visible, not in times of ease, but in moments when it is threatened, when the heart senses the possibility of loss and awakens to its own depth. He had similar reflections. He realized that he had been fortunate to have a partner who cared enough to notice the distance, who was willing to put effort into reconnecting. He understood that love is a responsibility as much as it is a feeling, and that attention, presence, and effort are the most powerful expressions of commitment. The awareness of what they stood to lose gave him a clarity he had never felt before, motivating him to be more present, more engaged, and more mindful of the bond they shared. Days turned into weeks, and the small steps continued. They shared meals, walks, conversations, and moments of silence that felt more meaningful than ever before. The sense of threat that had been looming began to transform into a quiet urgency to cherish each other. Love was waking up, not dramatically, but gently, steadily, in the awareness that it was fragile, precious, and worth fighting for. The routines that once felt mundane began to carry significance, each gesture a reminder that care, attention, and presence could restore a connection in the quiet evenings. They would sometimes sit together, holding hands without speaking, feeling the warmth and reassurance of each other's presence. It was a subtle, powerful reminder that love was alive, though it required vigilance, understanding, and deliberate attention. The warning signs had been clear, and they had chosen to respond, to nurture what was threatened, and to restore the bond that had seemed so effortless, but had been quietly slipping away by the end of this period. They had reached a tentative balance. The distance was still present at times, the fear of loss still lingered, but so did hope. They had begun to recognize that love needed to be actively maintained, that it awakened fully only when faced with the possibility of its absence. This realization, though unsettling, was empowering, giving both the courage and motivation to keep working on their connection, to face the challenges ahead with honesty, openness. In renewed care, the sense of unease grew heavier over time, subtle at first, but steadily undeniable. Both of them began to feel it in their daily lives, the way mornings felt a little colder and evenings stretched longer than they used to. Small disagreements started appearing again, though not explosive. They carried a weight neither had felt in months. She noticed his pauses, the moments when he would seem lost in thought while speaking to her, or when he didn't respond immediately to something she said. The comfort they had relied upon now felt fragile, and each small sign of distance became a silent alarm. One afternoon, she realized the depth of her fear. He had been unusually quiet, not dismissive, just absent in a way that left her feeling alone even in his presence. She asked him about it gently, trying not to sound accusatory, and he shrugged, saying he was tired. The explanation didn't satisfy her. Tiredness could not account for the absence she felt in his eyes. The way his attention seemed pulled elsewhere, the subtle disconnect that had settled between them. She wondered if he had begun to drift, if the love they had built over years could be lost without a fight. He, too, felt the tension. Though he still cared deeply, he began to sense that his partner's heart was quietly testing the bond they shared. The worry of losing her, of realizing what was precious only when it was slipping, started to creep into his thoughts. The routines that had once felt safe now seemed insufficient. He remembered the days when they had talked for hours about dreams, fears, and hopes, and realized how much he missed those conversations. For the first time in a long while, he felt the sharp edge of urgency, the realization that love required action or it could disappear. That evening, she made an effort to reconnect. She cooked a special meal, something they had enjoyed in the past, and set the table with care. When he arrived, she smiled and welcomed him warmly. He noticed the effort, and it stirred a small warmth inside him. Yet the fear of loss had already begun to creep in. He realized that this was more than a small lapse in attention, it was a turning point. He could feel the fragility of their connection, and it terrified him. The thought of losing her, of waking up one day and finding she had given up, made his chest tighten. He wanted to respond, to reach out, to say more than a simple thank you, but he felt clumsy, unsure how to bridge the growing distance. The nights that followed were restless. She lay awake, thinking about the quiet moments, the unanswered questions, the sense that something vital was at risk. She wondered if he truly felt the same way she did, if he understood the depth of concern that now pressed on her heart. He, meanwhile, was haunted by the fear of losing her, by the realization that love could awaken fully only when threatened. The thought of what might happen if they didn't act quickly left him restless as well. Both felt the weight of what had been neglected, the urgency of attention now unavoidable. One morning they found themselves in a tense conversation. She spoke openly about her fears, the moments when she had felt distant from him, and the loneliness that had crept in despite their physical proximity. His responses were hesitant at first, but gradually he admitted that he had been careless, that he had assumed love was constant and did not require conscious effort. The admission was raw, unpolished, and deeply human. They both understood, without needing to say it aloud, that their relationship had reached a critical point. Something had to change, or the quiet erosion of connection would continue. The following days were filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She tried to reconnect through small gestures, leaving notes, initiating meaningful conversations, sharing memories that reminded them both of their bond. He responded with varying degrees of attention, some days fully engaged, others caught in the routines of life that still threatened to pull him away. Each interaction was a test, a small battle to prove that their love could withstand neglect and rediscover strength. They began to reflect deeply on what had led to this point. Both acknowledged that the comfort they had once cherished had become a trap. It allowed them to drift apart quietly, to take each other for granted, and to assume that love would survive without active maintenance. The realization was painful but illuminating. They understood that love was not just a feeling, but a series of choices, repeated daily, consciously, with attention and care. In the weeks that followed, they began to take deliberate steps to repair the bond. He made an effort to listen more carefully, to engage fully in conversations, to notice the small things she did. She, in turn, remained patient and persistent, understanding that rebuilding trust and connection would take time. Each small success, a smile, a laugh, a shared story, felt monumental. They were not simply returning to the old pattern. They were creating a new awareness, a more conscious, intentional love. But the threat of loss still lingered. Both knew that they could not revert to complacency, that the awareness they had gained was fragile and required nurturing. There were moments of doubt, times when frustration or exhaustion threatened to undo the progress they had made. Yet in those moments, the fear of losing each other acted as a guiding force. It reminded them of the stakes, of the preciousness of their bond, and of the necessity of persistence. One afternoon, they went for a long walk in the park. The air was crisp, the trees painted with the colors of the season. As they walked side by side, they spoke openly, with honesty that had previously been rare. She shared her worries about the future, the moments when she felt distant, and the longing she had for the closeness they once enjoyed. He listened intently, admitting his own fears, his own failures, and his desire to rebuild what had been neglected. The conversation was long, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately cathartic. They felt a renewed sense of partnership, a recognition that love required vulnerability and courage. They began to integrate these lessons into everyday life. Meals became opportunities for conversation. Shared tasks became moments of connection, and small acts of care were no longer overlooked. Laughter returned, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes naturally, as they remembered the joy of being present with each other. The sense of threat that had loomed over them transformed into motivation, a gentle urgency that encouraged consistent effort and attentive care. Family and friends noticed the subtle changes. They observed the warmth returning, the renewed attention and engagement, and commented on how happy the couple seemed. Both felt a quiet reassurance, not just from external observation, but from the knowledge that they were actively choosing to nurture their love. The awareness of what they could have lost made every moment more meaningful, every gesture more significant. At night, they often sat together in silence, holding hands or leaning against each other. These moments, though quiet, carried a weight of understanding and shared experience. They realized that love was not defined by grand gestures alone, but by the consistency of care, the attention to small details, and the willingness to be present fully with each other. The fear of loss had acted as a catalyst, awakening them to what had always been there, but required recognition and effort. Through this process, they discovered a deeper level of intimacy. It was not the fiery passion of early love, but a steadier, more resilient connection built on awareness, communication, and shared commitment. They understood that relationships could face danger not only from external threats, but from internal neglect, and that recognizing these threats early was essential to preserving love. The threat itself had become a teacher, guiding them toward a more conscious and intentional partnership. By the end of this chapter of their lives, they were not perfect, nor were they free from doubt. Yet, they had reached a turning point, a moment where both understood the fragility and preciousness of their connection. Love had awakened fully, driven by the recognition of what could be lost. The bond they shared had been tested, challenged, and threatened. But it had survived because they chose to see, to act, and to nurture what mattered most. The lessons learned would guide them forward, shaping a love that was attentive, resilient, and deeply human. The effort to reconnect became the focus of their days. After realizing how fragile their love had become, both of them understood that attention and care could no longer be taken for granted. She began noticing the little things he did, and he began noticing hers. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning, now a cup of tea made without being asked, a smile that lingered a little longer, a touch on the shoulder. These moments, which had once passed without notice, were now signs of a heart reaching out and responding to another. They started intentionally creating time together. No longer relying on routine alone, they planned walks, shared meals, and quiet evenings where phones and distractions were set aside. In these moments, they would talk not just about schedules or chores, but about feelings, fears, and dreams. The conversations were sometimes difficult, awkward, and uncomfortable, but they were honest. She shared the loneliness she had felt, and he admitted the carelessness that had allowed it to grow. Both listened, without judgment. Realizing that vulnerability was now their strongest tool for rebuilding connection, he made conscious efforts to notice her every day. A compliment, a small gift, or simply asking how her day went became habitual, but intentional. It was not a dramatic transformation overnight, but a series of small steps that carried meaning. She felt the difference immediately, sensing the care and attention behind each gesture. Her own responses became warmer, more engaged, and more patient. Together, they began to reweave the fabric of their relationship. By careful stitch, they remembered past joys and moments of connection, using memories to rekindle affection. They laughed over inside jokes from years ago, reminisced about trips and shared experiences, and even revisited places that held significance for them. These moments reminded them of what had brought them together in the first place and why their bond was worth fighting for. The act of remembering became a bridge between the old closeness and the new awareness they were cultivating. Communication became their focus. Misunderstandings that might have caused tension before were now met with patience. Instead of reacting with frustration, they asked questions, sought clarification, and listened with intent. She learned to express her needs without anger, and he learned to respond without defensiveness. This mutual effort slowly replaced the quiet distance that had threatened their love. Each day felt like a small victory, a reminder that relationships required both persistence and mindfulness. They also discovered the power of small surprises. He left notes expressing appreciation or recalling a shared memory. She planned little treats or planned small adventures to break the monotony of routine. These actions were not grandiose, but they conveyed care, attention, and thoughtfulness. The gestures reminded them both that love thrived on acknowledgement, on making the other person feel seen, valued, and cherished. Each act, however small, reinforced their commitment to one another. Yet the path was not without obstacles. Old habits and insecurities sometimes resurfaced. He occasionally retreated into silence, forgetting the lessons he had learned, and she sometimes questioned whether her efforts were being recognized. These moments of doubt tested their patience and resilience. But rather than allowing frustration to dominate, they used these experiences as opportunities to reaffirm their commitment, to communicate openly, and to remind each other that growth required time and effort. The fear of losing each other remained a motivating force. It was a quiet, persistent awareness that fueled their determination to nurture their relationship. Each small act of attention, each meaningful conversation, became a conscious choice to protect what they valued. Love, they realized, did not thrive automatically. It awakened fully only when one understood its fragility and acted. Deliberately to preserve it, they began to integrate this awareness into everyday life. Meals became more than just nutrition. There were moments of connection. Shared tasks became opportunities for collaboration and communication. Even routine chores became chances to support one another and reinforce mutual care. The home that once felt comfortable but static now seemed alive with intention, warmth, and the quiet joy of conscious partnership. Friends and family noticed the changes. Conversations at gatherings included laughter, mutual attentiveness, and genuine engagement. The couple seemed more present, more connected, and more at ease with one another. Their renewed closeness inspired them, reinforcing the idea that effort and awareness could restore love even after periods of quiet distance. External recognition was secondary, but it added an additional layer of reassurance that their relationship was returning to a healthier, more balanced place. One afternoon, they decided to spend a day outdoors, away from the routines that had both comforted and constrained them. Walking through familiar streets and discovering new paths, they shared stories, hopes, and reflections. They talked about their fears, the mistakes of the past, and the lessons they had learned. The act of being together, fully present, reminded them of the depth of connection that had always existed and of the importance of sustaining it. Through intentional action, they also embraced moments of silence, learning to be comfortable together without needing to fill every pause with words. These silences became spaces of trust, allowing each to feel the presence of the other without pressure or expectation. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of a love that had been tested and was now slowly healing. He held her hand, recognizing the fragility and value of the bond they were rebuilding. Each quiet moment became a reaffirmation of their commitment, a recognition that love required both attention and patience. Evenings were spent reflecting, planning, and appreciating. They acknowledged the progress they had made and the challenges still ahead. They celebrated small victories, like a conversation that flowed smoothly, a shared laugh, or a gesture of care that felt meaningful. These acknowledgments reinforced the idea that love was not static, but a living, evolving presence that required both partners to participate fully as they continued these efforts. The fear that had once haunted them began to transform into a quiet confidence. They knew that love could be fragile, that attention was necessary, and that moments of neglect could lead to distance. But they also recognized that conscious effort, communication, shared vulnerability could restore what had been threatened. Their relationship became a balance of awareness, action, and appreciation. Strengthened by the very challenges that had once posed a risk, they began planning for the future with renewed clarity. Goals and dreams were shared and discussed with intention, ensuring that each decision considered both their individual needs and the health of their partnership. They understood that love was not only about feeling, but also about choices to prioritize each other, to communicate openly, and to maintain the connection that had survived threat and distance. Through these conscious actions, they discovered a depth of understanding that had previously been dormant. They learned that love was most alive when nurtured, and that its full presence emerged when confronted with the possibility of loss. Each effort, conversation, and gesture became a testament to the resilience and commitment required to sustain a meaningful relationship. They were learning to protect the fragile beauty of their bond, transforming the threat of loss into motivation for growth, connection, and renewal by the end of this chapter. Their love had been tested, challenged, and reshaped. The initial fear of loss had evolved into a conscious awareness that guided every interaction. They had moved beyond routine and habit, discovering that the heart required effort, attention, and vulnerability to thrive. Small acts of care, meaningful conversation, and shared moments became the foundation of a love that was no longer dormant but fully awake, resilient, and deeply human. The journey was ongoing, and challenges remained. But both felt prepared and committed to nurturing the bond they had fought to restore. The air in their home had changed. It was no longer the quiet, habitual comfort that had once masked a creeping distance. Now, it carried a warmth born of attention, care, and the hard-earned awareness that love required nurturing. Both of them understood that what they shared was precious and fragile, and that each day presented an opportunity to maintain, strengthen, and celebrate it. They had learned that love, when threatened, awakened a deeper awareness, a commitment to truly see each other and respond with presence. Mornings became a time of shared reflection and small rituals of appreciation. She would notice when he had stayed up late and make his favorite breakfast, while he would leave notes of gratitude or small surprises to start her day with a smile. These actions, simple as they were, carried enormous significance. They spoke of attention, care, and recognition. Each act reminded them that love was alive and required conscious participation, that the bond they shared could flourish only if tended to deliberately. Their conversations grew richer, filled with honesty, curiosity, and vulnerability. She asked about his dreams and fears, and he asked the same of her. They shared hopes for the future and reflections on the past, weaving together a narrative that reminded them of the depth of connection they had built. Disagreements still happened, but they were handled with care and patience. Each challenge became an opportunity to practice understanding, to strengthen the trust that had been tested before. They learned that communication was not just about solving problems, but about expressing presence, care, and commitment. They also discovered joy in the small, everyday moments. Cooking together, doing chores, or simply sitting side by side in silence became times of connection. They laughed at shared jokes, reminisced about the past, and created new memories that carried significance precisely because they were chosen with intention. Every gesture, every word, became a thread in a tapestry of renewed intimacy, a conscious effort to maintain the bond that had once been threatened by distance. The awareness of what could have been lost acted as a guiding force. Whenever one of them felt distracted or tempted by old habits of complacency, they remembered the quiet fear that had once hovered over their relationship. That fear had awakened them to the truth that love was not a constant but a living, breathing presence that needed recognition and care. It motivated them to be present, engaged, and attentive, transforming potential neglect into opportunity for connection. Friends and family noticed the change. There was a lightness to their interactions, a warmth in their presence that had been missing. Conversations at gatherings were filled with laughter, attentiveness, and engagement. Observers could sense the subtle depth of their bond, the quiet confidence that comes from having navigated difficulty and emerged stronger. These external affirmations were secondary, yet they reinforced the sense that their efforts were meaningful, that their love had survived and grown through conscious care. They also began planning for the future with intention. Decisions were made together, considering both individual needs and the health of their relationship. Goals were discussed openly, from career moves to personal aspirations, with an understanding that the partnership required shared vision and support. Each plan was a reaffirmation of commitment, a deliberate choice to maintain the love that had once been threatened and was now fully awake. In moments of quiet reflection, they recognized how much they had learned. Love was not simply a feeling that remained constant without attention. It required effort, awareness, and the courage to confront distance, fear, and vulnerability. They understood that even years of shared routine could allow a bond to weaken if neglected. But they also learned that with persistence, care, and conscious action, love could not only survive threat but grow stronger and more resilient. They continued to create rituals of connection. Weekly walks, shared meals, and intentional conversations became part of their life. These moments, once taken for granted, were now sacred. They reminded them of the journey they had traveled, from comfort and complacency, through fear and distance, to awareness and effort. Each ritual was a statement of presence, an acknowledgement that love was a living, breathing force that required their attention. They also embraced vulnerability more fully. Confessions of doubt, fear, and regret were met with compassion rather than judgment. They recognized that sharing weakness was not a threat, but a pathway to deeper intimacy. She felt seen and understood when she expressed insecurity, and he felt strengthened when he admitted carelessness or fear of loss. The mutual acknowledgement of imperfections became a source of connection, reinforcing the trust that had once been tested. In the evenings, they would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation, feeling the presence of the other. These moments, though simple, carried immense significance. They were a reminder that love was not about grand gestures alone, but about the consistent, deliberate attention to each other's presence, feelings, and needs. Holding hands, sharing a look, or leaning into one another became acts of affirmation, not quiet yet powerful declarations of commitment. Through these efforts, they found joy in the ordinary. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, a compliment during a busy day, a thoughtful question about the other's feelings all became significant. The mundane was transformed into meaningful connection. Each interaction was an opportunity to reinforce the bond, to remind each other that love was alive, precious, and worth protecting. The threat they had once faced had taught them that awareness and effort were essential to sustaining what they cherished. The journey also deepened their empathy. They became more patient, understanding, and attuned to each other's needs and emotions. Where they had once assumed, they now asked. Where they had once reacted impulsively, they now reflected. This growth strengthened not just their love, but also their individual understanding of themselves and each other. They discovered that the best way to protect love was to cultivate understanding, patience, and presence. As time passed, the fear of loss became less urgent, but more profound in its impact. It had served its purpose, awakening them to the depth of their connection and the need for conscious effort. Now, love thrived not because of threat, but because of choice, effort, and shared commitment. They had transformed fear into awareness, distance into connection, and complacency into intention. Their home, once a place of comfort alone, now radiated warmth, presence, and intention. It was a living testament to what could happen when love was recognized, valued, and actively maintained. The small gestures, the deliberate conversations, the shared moments together, they formed a resilient and meaningful connection that both cherished deeply in their reflections. They understood that love does not always awaken fully in the safety of routine. It often requires the confrontation of loss, the awareness of fragility, and the courage to act. Yet, when awakened, it can transform into something stronger, more intentional, and more deeply human. Their journey had been challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately enlightening. They had discovered that love, once threatened, could awaken fully, resilient, and alive, ready to thrive through attention, care, and shared commitment. By the end of this period, both felt a renewed sense of partnership. They knew the path forward would require ongoing effort, patience, and awareness, but they were ready. The fear of losing each other had evolved into gratitude for each other's presence, a conscious choice to nurture their bond, and an appreciation for the lessons learned. Love was no longer dormant or taken for granted. It was fully awake, deliberate, and resilient as they held each other in quiet moments, shared laughter, and reflected on their journey. They felt the full weight and beauty of what they had rebuilt. Their story had moved from comfort through threat into intentional connection. They had learned that love, when threatened, had the power to awaken, teaching them to see, appreciate, and protect the bond they shared. And in that awakening, they found a love deeper, more conscious, and more enduring than they had ever known. Life after their renewed understanding felt like a delicate balance, a dance between awareness and comfort. They knew that love, once threatened, could awaken to a depth they had never fully appreciated. Every day became an opportunity to nurture that love, to ensure it remained vibrant and alive. She noticed the little ways he showed care, pausing to ask how she felt, remembering small details from their conversations, offering support without being prompted. Each gesture was a quiet reassurance that their connection had strengthened and matured. He, in turn, found himself more attuned to her needs. He began noticing subtle shifts in her moods, responding to unspoken signals with gentle attentiveness. Where he had once been distracted, now he chose to be present. He learned that being fully engaged required not just physical presence, but emotional investment, a willingness to understand and respond to her feelings consistently. The lessons of the past had etched themselves deeply into his awareness, and he approached each day with intention. They discovered new ways to connect beyond the familiar routines that had once defined their relationship. Even simple activities, cooking, walking, or tidying up the house, were now opportunities for shared presence and dialogue. They learned to laugh together again, sometimes at memories, sometimes at the absurdities of daily life. These moments, while seemingly ordinary, carried profound significance because they were approached with attention, appreciation, and a conscious effort to maintain connection. Communication became the lifeblood of their renewed relationship. They made time to discuss not just the practicalities of life, but also their feelings, dreams, and fears. She would share moments of doubt, and he would respond with reassurance and empathy. He would express insecurities he had previously kept hidden, and she would listen with patience and understanding. This mutual openness reinforced trust, allowing them to experience vulnerability without fear. They realized that love was not merely about affection, but about shared honesty and the courage to face emotions together. They also began exploring new experiences, small adventures that broke the monotony of daily life. Weekend trips, new hobbies, or even just a spontaneous outing became ways to create fresh memories and deepen their bond. These experiences reminded them that love could be dynamic and evolving, not fixed or predictable. Each adventure was a shared journey, an opportunity to learn about each other anew, and to strengthen the partnership that had once faced quiet distance. Family and friends continued to notice the change. There was a glow in their interactions, a sense of harmony and attentiveness that had once been missing. Their renewed presence with each other inspired admiration, not because they were perfect, but because they had chosen to engage, to nurture, and to persist. The awareness that love required conscious effort had transformed them individually and as a couple, and those around them could sense the difference. Despite the positive changes, challenges still arose. Old patterns, sometimes re-emerged moments of distraction, minor disagreements, or lapses in attentiveness. Yet, instead of allowing these challenges to create distance, they treated them as reminders to stay engaged and intentional. Each small obstacle became an opportunity to practice patience, empathy, and understanding. They had learned that vigilance in love was ongoing. It's not a one-time effort, and that sustaining connection required consistent care. They also discovered the importance of celebrating progress, no matter how small. Every meaningful conversation, shared laugh, or thoughtful gesture became a milestone in their journey. These celebrations reinforced their commitment, reminding them that love could grow stronger through conscious attention. They learned to appreciate not only the big moments, but the everyday acts that sustained their bond, recognizing that love was built as much in the quiet details as in the grand gestures. In quiet moments, they reflected on the lessons of their past struggles. They understood that the fear of losing each other had been a catalyst, awakening them to the depth and fragility of their connection. That awareness had sparked action, leading them to rebuild their bond with deliberate care. They knew that love was not automatic, but a conscious choice that required effort, patience, and attentiveness. This understanding became the foundation of their relationship moving forward. They also grew individually through this process. She became more confident in expressing her needs and emotions, understanding that vulnerability was a strength rather than a weakness. He became more mindful of the impact of his actions and words, learning that attentiveness and presence were essential expressions of love. Both discovered that personal growth and relational growth were deeply intertwined, and that nurturing each other also meant nurturing themselves. Their home became a reflection of this renewed connection. Spaces that had once felt ordinary now carried warmth and intentionality. Simple gestures, a cup of tea prepared with care, a shared seat on the couch, a quiet conversation after a long day became symbols of love in action. They realized that the environment around them was a canvas on which their daily choices painted a picture of care, attention, and mutual respect. They began planning long-term goals together, ensuring that their shared vision aligned with their individual aspirations. Career decisions, personal growth, and future plans were discussed openly, with both partners contributing ideas and compromises. This collaborative approach strengthened their bond, creating a sense of partnership and shared responsibility. They understood that love was not just about emotion, but also about building a life together with intention, awareness, and shared purpose. Even in moments of tension or stress, they applied the lessons they had learned. Instead of allowing frustration to escalate, they communicated openly, acknowledged each other's perspectives, and worked together to find solutions. They recognized that challenges were inevitable, but the strength of their bond came from how they responded, not from avoiding difficulty. Each conflict became an opportunity to practice empathy, patience, and resilience. They also cherished the moments of quiet intimacy, the times when words were unnecessary. Sitting together in the evening, holding hands, or simply sharing a look of understanding became profound expressions of love.